The last of the so-called special topics that we're going to discuss in this subject is metaphors. So metaphor is a huge subject there's tons of research about it. We could spend a whole semester just talking about metaphor, but for this module, we'll just have a very brief overview and introduction to what this topic is. So as usual, let's start off with some examples to see what's special about metaphors. So let's think about three closely related sentences. Here we've got like, this brownie is as hard as a rock. This brownie is like a rock. This brownie is a rock. So if I think back to like my middle school English lessons, we would say that the first two of these sentences are similes, right? Where they say this brownie is like something else. And the last one is a metaphor, where I just say this brownie is something else. The two similes here are different in an important way also. So the first one, this brownie is as hard as a rock, it explicitly says in what way the brownie is like a rock, right? It says the brownie is like a rock in terms of how hard it is. The second simile is maybe a little bit more abstract because it says the brownie is like a rock and it doesn't say how. Right? It leaves you to figure out in what way is the brownie like a rock. Is it because it's hard? Is it because it's dry? Is it because it's in the dirt? Right? So you probably need some context to figure out what comparison the speaker is making here. And the metaphor goes one step further because, like the second simile, the metaphor doesn't tell you what's the relationship between brownie and rock. And it's also just a patently false sentence, right? So brownies aren't rocks. So when you see a metaphor or you hear a metaphor, you have to figure out that, well, this sentence doesn't literally mean the brownie is a rock. It means it's comparing brownies to rocks in some way, and we have to figure out what that comparison is. So that's kind of what's special about metaphors. It takes something from one domain, like brownies, cooking, food kind of stuff, and compares it to something in another domain, like rocks, and you have to figure out what that comparison is, right? That's what's special about metaphors. Now, so in this example, it might seem like metaphors are kind of like very special figurative language, but actually metaphors are really common in everyday life. And in fact, probably everything we say includes metaphors. So just for a quick example, here's something I saw on someone's t-shirt recently. Someone was wearing a t-shirt and it said, "Keep your eyes on the stars and your feet on the ground." Actually, there's several metaphors in this. So for example, keep your eyes on the stars. It doesn't mean look at the stars, but it means have high goals, right? Dream about big things, whatever. That's a metaphor. But there's also some more mundane metaphors in here that you might not notice so easily. So for example, we have the word on 2 times in this slogan, but the word on means very different things, right? So keep your feet on the ground. The word on in that utterance means something like keep your feet touching the ground. Hopefully it doesn't mean that when we say keep your eyes on the stars, because you don't want your eye touching a star, you would burn up and melt into nothing, right? So it seems like on in the top, the first part of this slogan, on means like looking at, focused on, pointed towards. In the bottom part, on means touching, like in contact with. So the word on seems to have very different meanings here. Maybe we could say that the word on itself has a lot of different meanings, or there are 2 slightly different words that are both pronounced on but mean different things. But especially for prepositions like this, there could be hundreds of different meanings of this word. And it's not very likely that that's really how a person understands language. So kind of the basic idea that we've had throughout pragmatics is that words or expressions mean a specific thing, and then the other interpretations that we get out of them come from pragmatics, not from meaning, right? So they come from thinking about what the person might mean. They come from thinking about the context. So the idea here is that maybe the word on really just has one meaning, but we use pragmatics and we use metaphor to figure out the different ways to interpret on in these two different sentences. So that's the idea behind metaphor. The big question is, how do we actually understand metaphors, right? How do we figure out what a person means when they're using a metaphor? How do metaphors work? One of the original proposals that people made to explain how metaphors work was they suggested that it was based on Gricean maxims, right? So we understand metaphors by using the cooperative principle that we've learned about in previous modules. And specifically, they talked about the maxim of quality. Remember, a few modules ago, we talked about the cooperative principle. We talked about 4 different maxims of conversation that people are normally expected to follow. There are maxims of quality, quantity, relation, manner. The important one here is quality, which means don't say things that you know are false, or don't say things that you don't know are true. And so the idea here was that, for example, if someone says, this brownie is a rock, that's obviously false, right? So if a person says that, we realize, that person's breaking they look like they are breaking the maxim of quality. They're saying something that's obviously false. But because of the cooperative principle and because of how pragmatics and communication works, I should assume that the person's not actually saying something false, but they're hinting something different than what they mean. And so then we go through some process to figure out, okay, if the brownie is not literally a rock, but in what property is the brownie like a rock? And then we figure out what the person means. So that was the classic proposal about how metaphor works. One of the problems with that, though, is that not all metaphors are literally false. So for example, think of a metaphor like no man is an island, right? So this means no one exists totally independently. Everyone's part of society. We depend on each other, or whatever. This is a metaphor, but it's not actually false, right? The literal meaning of no man is an island is true. So based on the previous explanation that we notice when someone says obviously false, and then we do some pragmatic reasoning to figure out what that means, that explanation would not work here, right? Because if we start with the literal meaning, we would notice they said something that's literally true, and we wouldn't need to go through the next step of interpretation. But obviously we do, because when someone says no man is an island, we figure out the metaphorical meaning. So some more explanation is needed to figure out how metaphors work. Again, like I said at the beginning of this video, metaphor is a very big topic. There's a lot of research about it. So there are a lot of proposals about how this works that are newer than this kind of classic proposal that I mentioned. If you're interested, you check out the module online, and there's some suggestions for reading about it. It's a very big topic, but for now you can try to brainstorm about how you could update this explanation to explain how metaphor works for cases like this, like no man is an island, where the literal meaning is actually true.